Welcome back. As we've been reporting for months, Venezuela is in a political and humanitarian crisis. Earlier this month, the United Nations announced that there were about 4 million Venezuelan refugees. That's one of the largest groups of people displaced from any country anywhere in the world. The minimum wage in that country right now is around $6 a month. We've shown you the blackouts, the lines for gasoline in one of the richest oil countries in the world, the poorly stocked hospitals. We talked about people being asked to pick up their loved ones from morgues there, people raiding graves for teeth and other valuables on dead bodies. We've also talked about the oppressive regime of Nicolas Maduro, and it's no wonder so many are choosing to leave and flee their homes. But there is an alternative. Earlier this year, opposition leader Juan Guaido stood before thousands of protesters in Caracas and declared himself the president of Venezuela. He's been recognized by the United States and about 30 other countries. And joining us now to talk more about the situation in Venezuela is Louis Ball. He is the founder and CEO of Pan Am Post, also a well-known businessman based out of Boca Raton, Florida. Great to see you, Louis.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the situation in Venezuela. Why hasn't the Maduro regime toppled yet?
Well, it's a number of factors. First of all, they control the guns. And as long as they control the army and the paramilitary police, the National Guard, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. And they have turned the army into this kind of a Praetorian Guard,
right,
protecting Maduro. And the other reason is support from countries like Cuba. Cuba has thousands of personnel in Venezuela. Cuba runs the intelligence apparatus. And the actual personal bodyguard of Maduro and his clique. So the Cuban part of it is the Cuban intervention, part is the army that has been bought off. And as it happens in most communist countries, in Cuba, in North Korea, the army is part of the corrupt clique that runs the country.
Right.
And that's the main reason. They have the guns.
Right, and that's why we have the civilian commander-in-chief in this country. Maduro is basically the commander of the Venezuelan military at this point, has paid off a lot of those commanders. Now, your paper is reporting that Maduro has given Russia about 2/3, or two of its gas deposits, rather, near Trinidad and Tobago down in the Caribbean, further evidence that Russian President Vladimir Putin is challenging the U.S., and he has serious designs on the future of Venezuela, correct? Yeah,
well, Russia has had enormous business with the regime since the days of Hugo Chavez. I mean, they sold billions of, Venezuela was Russia's largest customer in the Western Hemisphere for many years, and probably the world's largest customer for Russian weapons, other than China. And so for years, Russia has had an interest, and also Russia has large oil investments now in Venezuela through Russian companies. And yes, I think Russia has a lot of interest in keeping those ties with Venezuela. I don't think necessarily Russia will act militarily to support the Maduro regime, but Russia has definitely been supporting the Maduro regime.
Right. We heard reports that some of these Russian mercenaries have been pulled out of Venezuela because Venezuela couldn't pay for that anymore. We would imagine there was some kind of in-kind gas or oil contribution made to maybe keep them there. Also, we talked about Cuba, we talked about Russia, but what about China? They're also jockeying for position and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Chinese President Xi says he's willing to play a constructive role in the future of Venezuela, but constructive role seems to be a loaded term. What do you think that means?
Well, again, China's interest in Venezuela is mostly economic. They are the country's largest creditor. Venezuela owes China about $60 billion in loans. And China has also been taking advantage of Venezuelan oil riches by trying to get into the Venezuelan oil reserves. So again, I mean, this is part of the geopolitical, say, rivalry between the U.S. and China. China probably sees Venezuela as a foothold in the Caribbean, 2.5 hours flight from Miami.
Right.
So for them, it's a strategic and an economic interest that they have. The Chinese, however, are worried about the fact that Maduro has literally bankrupted the country, because they do worry whether or not they will get paid their $60 billion.
Right, so that's, just more evidence that they're not going to turn their back on what's taking place in Venezuela. They feel like there's something that belongs to China currently in Venezuela, mostly their natural resources, most likely. We also want to get your take on a story out of the Wall Street Journal about Maduro selling off his gold to African nations. According to the report, in early March, at least 4.7 tons of gold worth over $300 million moved on Russian jetliners from Venezuela to Uganda. Now that gold appears to be gone.
Yeah.
What are you hearing about
Well,
this?
I don't think he's selling it to African countries. He's selling it through African countries, probably because.
Sorry, I misspoke there.
Yeah, that's because that's the way to get the trace, any trace of the
Right.
transaction lost in African banking and things like this. Well, what's happening is as Maduro bankrupted the Venezuelan economic system, between Chavez and Maduro, for example, they nationalized or took over without payment over 10,000 manufacturing companies. They have been using gold as a means of exchange, and it's very practical for them because it's very hard to trace the transactions. You have to remember that the graft in Venezuela is probably the largest in history in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S., just the U.S. in actual courts in the U.S., Chavez's former national treasurer admitted to having received $1 billion in bribes.
And that's what I think is so hard for a lot of Americans to understand is how the military, I mean, I guess they're just being bought off, right? There's simply more bribes and
Absolutely.
bribes after bribes, because don't you think at a certain point this uprising we've seen would, you know, government officials taking billions of dollars in bribes, $1 billion in bribes would really be the final straw in this issue for
Well,
the
some of those people receiving billion-dollar bribes are actually army generals. That's the issue. Just like in Cuba, President Trump talked about this when he recently imposed sanctions on Cuba, how a lot of the businesses in Cuba related to tourism are actually owned by the Cuban military.
Right.
So this is a very typical situation of communist countries. What's going on there?
You know, the U.S. is, you know, has talked about potential military involvement, military support, but so far the only thing concrete the U.S. military has done is send a naval hospital ship down there towards Venezuela. In your opinion, is the United States doing enough when it comes to military backing, or at least projecting that military backing?
Well, the U.S. Under President Trump has done more to support the return of democracy for Venezuela than any other president before. And I mean, 10 times more than whatever the Obama administration did,
Sure.
which was, at some point, we didn't know which side it was on, to tell you the truth. But
And the whole gambit with Cuba now really looks like a big disaster based on what's happening in Venezuela.
Exactly. So, so the U.S. has done a lot, and short of military support. I am of the personal opinion, and some people like me, that we will not get a regime change in Venezuela without some kind of armed intervention.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking Marines landing on landing craft
Sure.
on the shores of Venezuela, but there will have to be some kind of armed intervention. Former Venezuelan ambassador to the UN, Diego Arria, talks about the principle of protection that was used for Kosovo and in the Balkans in the 1990s.
Florida Governor
Something
Rick
to that
Scott has
effect.
talked about some sort of, you know, naval blockade of Venezuela. What do you think about that as an option?
Well, that could be an option. I think we have to explore any option. I mean, there are options of, let's say, kind of special forces activities supported by Venezuelans on the ground. So there are many options, but I don't think a negotiated solution it's possible, it's feasible, because these people are this is not a government, this is a mafia running a country.
And then that's what, you know, a lot of the reports that get back to the United States now is that there's some sort of negotiation going on, but you don't see that as a likely scenario. And what then ultimately do you think is Maduro's endgame? If there is a military incursion of some sort, he can't stay the leader of Venezuela. What happens to him?
Well, he has to leave somehow.
And where does he go?
Or either he leaves eventually, or he'll end up with like some of the Eastern European leaders who were pretty much lynched on the streets eventually when things turned. And I'm talking like Ceausescu in Romania,
right.
people like that. He'll have to leave.
Gaddafi in Libya, too.
Or Gaddafi in Libya, exactly. Right now he has the guns, he has Cuban support, he has diplomatic and economic support from Russia and China.
Right.
So right now he's not about to fall. I mean, I don't think the regime is about to fall. The regime has been weakened by U.S. sanctions. UN sanctions have been smart and strategic. I think, and I have to say, part of the reason why Maduro hasn't fallen is because Europe has not accompanied the U.S. in imposing sanctions against the regime.
There's
The
a
regime
trend here. You know, in a lot of these issues we're having with other countries around the world, Europe doesn't seem willing to stand up to these issues and really face them head on.
Exactly. And Europe, in this case, is giving Maduro a way out of the U.S. sanctions. And Maduro and his clique, all these people with the billion-dollar bribes, are keeping their money in Europe, and the Europeans know it.
Well, for folks here in this country, tell us more about the Pan Am Post if they want to stay abreast of what's going on.
Well, the Pan Am Post is an online publication that we have a Spanish website and an English website. The Spanish website has a lot more content. We have more people working on the Spanish website. But if you want to keep in touch with what's going on in Latin America, I believe we're a very good source for news and opinion on Latin America.
Well, we appreciate having you here, Luis. Of course, I'll check it out. I always advocate people need to pay attention to what's happening in Venezuela. It's right in our backyard. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, and all these other foreign nations that are messing around here in our backyard. It's an important story to keep an eye on. And I'll certainly check out Pan Am Post a lot more often. Great to meet you, Luis, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, John.
Our pleasure.
Appreciate it.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing news channel. Newsmax TV is now available for free on your smartphone. Just go to your iPhone or Android store and download the free Newsmax TV app. Then you can watch free TV news with an American spin anytime, anywhere in the world. Newsmax TV, real news for real people.